Think for a moment about the primary purpose of an election. Like, if you are examining your own assumptions right now, you'd likely conclude that the goal of casting a ballot is to find the best possible candidate.
Right, or at least the most popular one.
Exactly. I mean, it's the fundamental premise our modern representative democracy is built on.
Yeah.
You cast a vote to elevate the person you believe is the most qualified or the most capable of leading. But today, we're going to completely deconstruct that assumption.
We really are. And we're examining a pretty unconventional set of source materials for this deep dive. We have a recorded university lecture, along with the accompanying slide deck that was delivered by Professor Voshin Shank back in March of 2025.
Yeah, and it's a very rigorous, highly technical exploration of political
It
systems.
is. Our mission here is to unpack the professor's mathematical algorithms for voting and parliamentary structure. We're going to explore how applying strict mathematics and even signal processing concepts to the ballot box might actually resolve some of our deepest structural political dysfunctions.
And we should set the tone right up front. The material is distinctly grounded, it's analytical, it's a very necessary departure from the usual noise surrounding political discourse. We're looking at democratic representation strictly through the lens of mathematical optimization.
No taking sides, no partisan talking points, just the math.
Exactly. But to understand the solutions the professor proposes, these new algorithms, we first have to redefine the true goal of an election. Why does the professor argue that seeking the best candidate is a mathematically and logically flawed premise?
Well, it stems from the functional reality of political campaigns. We claim we want the best candidate, but in practice, the architecture of our elections usually just identifies the most popular one, and those are two very different metrics.
Right, because popularity doesn't equal competence.
Precisely. The professor points out that we don't really have any objective methodology for determining who the best person is. Political campaigns, they don't operate like corporate job interviews. Candidates don't submit standardized resumes and get graded on their technical competencies.
They definitely don't.
Instead, campaigns are largely oppositional. They rely heavily on criticizing opponents. So a candidate rarely proves they are objectively the best. They merely attempt to prove their opponent is worse.
I have to pause on that point, though, because discarding the search for the best or most visionary leader, it seems a bit pessimistic. If we aren't optimizing for excellence, aren't we just engineering a system that guarantees we elect mediocre politicians?
It's a fair question, but it's not about engineering mediocrity. It's about mitigating systemic failure. The professor introduces a psychological thesis here regarding the asymmetry of human emotion, specifically the structural difference between happiness and misery.
Okay, how does that apply to voting?
Well, this asymmetry is the foundation of the math that follows. The premise, which is well documented in behavioral psychology, is that happiness is a temporary, fleeting category.
Meaning, we get used to it quickly.
Exactly. When an electorate achieves a desired outcome, say their preferred visionary candidate wins, they feel elated. But humans habituate to positive states very fast. You normalize the victory. Eventually, the electorate tires of the success, and their emotional baseline just resets.
But misery operates on a completely different timeline.
It does. Misery is a persistent, enduring, and compounding state. If a citizen or a demographic group is deeply impoverished, socially marginalized, or structurally disadvantaged by the policies of the state, they cannot easily habituate to that.
Right, you can't normalize not being able to feed your family.
Or access basic infrastructure, exactly. Misery lingers, it festers. So if we accept this emotional asymmetry, that happiness is fleeting but misery is persistent, it necessitates a fundamental shift in what an election algorithm should actually be trying to achieve.
Because if you design a system that optimizes for making a narrow majority, say 51% of the electorate, deliriously happy.
You might simultaneously be plunging the remaining 49% into structural misery.
Right. And because that misery persists long after the 51% have forgotten their initial happiness, that 49% becomes a permanently volatile element within the society.
Which leads to the core thesis of the lecture. The true goal of an optimal election system is not about finding the best or maximizing peak happiness. The mathematical goal must be to minimize overall societal dissatisfaction. It's about identifying and electing the least unacceptable candidate.
The compromise candidate. The person who might not be anyone's absolute first choice, but who avoids triggering that persistent misery in any major demographic block.
Exactly. And the practical application of this, the reason this matters for the stability of a nation, is profound. Choosing the least unacceptable candidate prevents deep societal fractures. It mitigates the underlying conditions that lead to social unrest.
The professor explicitly refers to the prevention of colored revolutions, right?
Yeah.
Movements born out of deep systemic disenfranchisement.
Yes. By mathematically ensuring that the victor is the least hated, you maintain societal peace. You favor a compromise that keeps the baseline of the society stable.
So before we get into the specific algorithms designed to find that least unacceptable candidate, we really need to establish the baseline of where current systems fail. The lecture critiques the two dominant models of democratic representation, the proportional system and the majority system.
Let's look at the proportional system first.
Right. This is the model where citizens cast a vote for a party list rather than an individual representative. If a party secures 30% of the national vote, they receive 30% of the seats in the legislature. On the surface, it sounds mathematically fair. Where is the systemic flaw?
The structural flaw lies in the alignment of incentives and accountability. Because the voters are selecting a static list that's curated by the central party leadership, the individuals who actually occupy those seats are entirely beholden to the party bosses.
They aren't tethered to a local voter base at all.
Not at all. The electorate has no direct mechanism to hold an individual parliament member accountable for their actions.
The lecture actually provides a highly specific critique of how this manifests on the parliament floor. The professor notes that these representatives frequently become entirely compliant loyalists who operate under a mechanism described as voting on a bell.
Yes, voting on a bell. It's a literal description of the parliamentary mechanics in some of these systems.
It's wild to think about.
It really is. During a legislative session, the members of parliament do not independently evaluate the merits of a proposed law. Instead, they wait for the parliamentary leader or the party whip to physically or symbolically ring a bell.
And that auditory cue tells them what to do.
It signals exactly how the entire block is supposed to cast their vote. In this mathematical equation, the parliament member effectively represents 0 citizens. They represent only the central party apparatus.
Additionally, proportional systems generally fail to guarantee any geographic or territorial representation. Because the list is national, a party could technically fill its allotted seats entirely with candidates who reside in the capital city.
Which happens frequently. The rural areas or secondary cities might generate a significant portion of the party's vote, but they end up with 0 local representatives in the room where the decisions are actually made.
Which brings us to the alternative model. The majority system, often referred to as winner takes all. This system is designed specifically to connect a politician to a local geographic base. You vote for an individual to represent your specific territorial district.
But while it solves that geographic disconnect, it introduces a severe mathematical distortion regarding the disenfranchisement of political minorities.
Mechanically, how does that work out?
Well, in a winner-takes-all system featuring multiple candidates, an individual can secure a legislative seat with only, say, 35% of the local vote.
Meaning 65% voted for someone else.
Exactly. 65% of the electorate in that district explicitly voted against that person, yet they receive 0 representation. The candidate who won takes 100% of the legislative power for that seat.
And when you scale that dynamic across a nation, it routinely creates a highly disproportional national legislature. A political party might win a massive filibuster-proof majority of seats while only holding a slight edge or even a deficit in the overall national popular vote.
And the most recognizable exploitation of this geographic majority system is gerrymandering.
Right. Originating way back with Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry in 1812, whose weirdly drawn district resembled a salamander. We all know the basic mechanics of gerrymandering, packing and cracking districts to steal a majority. But what is fascinating here is how the professor views this not merely as a political failing, but strictly as a mathematical exploit of the one representative, one vote rule.
It's an algorithmic manipulation of boundaries. A political party that is actually in the minority can steal a majority of the legislative seats by manipulating the geographic containers of the voters.
So they pack the opposition's voters into a few heavily concentrated districts,
conceding those specific seats by massive margins.
Right.
And then they crack or distribute their own voters thinly across numerous other districts, ensuring they win a large number of seats by very narrow, calculated margins.
The sources provide a stark historical data point on how extreme this mathematical distortion can become. The lecture references the 1990 and 1992 elections in Serbia, The geographic districts were constructed in a manner that produced wildly unequal representation.
The disparity is staggering.
Yeah, the professor notes that a district in the capital, Belgrade, was drawn such that one member of parliament represented roughly 200,000 voters. Simultaneously, a district drawn in Kosovo elected a member of parliament with only 500 voters.
The mathematical weight of a voter in that Belgrade district was a tiny fraction of the weight of a voter in the other district. It's a perfect illustration of how territorial boundaries can be weaponized to predetermine the outcome of an election, entirely bypassing the actual will of the broader population.
So we're left with two flawed architectures. Proportional systems that create unaccountable party loyalists who vote on a bell, and majority systems that disenfranchise massive swaths of voters and are highly vulnerable to geographic manipulation.
This is the landscape the professor is attempting to correct, and his approach to analyzing this is highly unorthodox. He steps completely outside the realm of traditional political science and approaches the act of voting as a telecommunications problem.
Which is such a unique framework. He views democratic elections through the strict lens of signal processing. Let's spend some time unpacking this because it really is the theoretical foundation for the algorithms we're about to discuss.
In a traditional telecommunications model, you have a transmitter sending a signal to a receiver. The professor maps this directly onto the political arena. The political candidate is the transmitter. The candidate is emitting a signal.
But this signal isn't a simple uniform wave.
No, it's a complex, multi-dimensional transmission. The signal consists of the candidate's stance on various independent policy dimensions. The lecture lists specific examples. A candidate's position on the status of Kosovo, their policy regarding the national exchange rate, their stance on European Union membership, their plans for road infrastructure development, and their track record on corruption.
So every candidate transmits a complex package across all these independent dimensions. And on the other end of the transmission, you have the voters. The voters are the receivers.
But just as in physical telecommunications, the signal rarely arrives at the receiver in pristine condition. The transmission is obscured and degraded by what signal processing refers to as noise.
This is where the mathematical mapping becomes truly insightful. The professor uses specific academic concepts from telecommunications to model voter behavior. Let's look at the concept of Rayleigh fading.
Right. In radio communications, Rayleigh fading occurs when a signal is scattered by the environment, bouncing off buildings or terrain arriving at the receiver via multiple paths, often out of phase, causing the signal to degrade or fade.
How does Rayleigh fading translate to a voter listening to a politician, though?
It represents the degradation of a policy message over time and through the environment of media and human bias. A candidate might state a clear policy on infrastructure. But by the time that signal reaches the voter, it is bounced through partisan news filters, social media commentary, and the voter's own inherent biases.
The signal fades.
Exactly. The voter's interest in that specific dimension might also fade over a 4-year term. The clarity of the candidate's initial transmission is lost in the environmental noise.
There's another telecommunications concept utilized in the lecture, the Z-channel. A Z-channel is an asymmetric binary channel. In data transmission, it means a transmitted 0 might be incorrectly received as a 1 due to noise, but a transmitted 1 is never accidentally received as a 0. It's a one-way distortion. How does the professor apply the math of the Z-channel to the ballot box?
The Z-channel mathematically models what we would call a voter's blind spot. Imagine a voter who is fiercely dedicated to a single issue, perhaps European Union membership. If a candidate aligns perfectly with that voter on the EU dimension, the voter might completely ignore the candidate's terrible track record on corruption.
So the voter effectively turns a blind eye to the negative data point.
Precisely. The corruption signal is transmitted, but the receiver fails to register it. However, the asymmetry works the other way, too. The voter won't invent a virtue that isn't there. The Z-channel models this precise asymmetric filtering of information by the human brain.
But utilizing these concepts, modeling the candidate's multidimensional signal, accounting for the Rayleigh fading of message degradation, and calculating the Z-channel blind spots of the voters, the professor's mathematical models can measure something highly specific. They measure the exact distance of dissatisfaction between an individual voter and an elected official.
That is the crucial metric right there. The system calculates the aggregate distance between what the voters actually received and what they desired, factoring in all the noise and distortion. The overarching objective of a functional democratic system must be to minimize that total distance across the entire population.
So we have redefined the goal. Minimize overall dissatisfaction and elect the least unacceptable candidate. And we have the analytical framework, measuring the distance between the candidate signal and the voter's reception. How do we design an actual ballot that achieves this?
This brings us to the professor's first major algorithmic proposal: balanced approval voting.
The mechanics of this algorithm are a radical departure from the standard ballot. When a voter steps into the booth under the balanced approval model, they aren't restricted to selecting a single name. Instead, the voter can vote F or R as many candidates as they wish. Furthermore, they are also permitted to vote against as many candidates as they wish.
But the algorithm relies on a very specific mathematical rule regarding the ratio of those votes. The rule dictates that the number of for votes cast by an individual voter must strictly exceed the number of against votes on their ballot.
So if you decide to cast 3 against votes, you are mathematically required to cast at least 4 for votes. Why is this specific ratio mandated?
The rule is designed to force constructive participation. If a voter could simply vote against everyone they disliked without endorsing anyone, the system would merely measure aggregate anger without identifying a consensus alternative.
That makes perfect sense. By forcing the voter to identify more acceptable options than unacceptable ones, the algorithm mathematically steers the electorate toward identifying compromises.
Exactly. And the final score for any candidate in the election is calculated with absolute simplicity: their total for votes minus their total against votes.
Let's walk through the theoretical examples provided in the lecture to see how this simple subtraction actively favors the compromise candidate over the polarizing figure. Consider a hypothetical candidate who is highly charismatic but deeply polarizing. They hold 40% strong core support in the electorate.
Those voters are thrilled by the candidate's signal.
Right, but the remaining 60% of the public finds the candidate's signal completely unacceptable. Under a traditional plurality system, that concentrated 40% might easily be enough to win a crowded multi-candidate race.
That happens frequently in modern democracies. But under the balanced approval algorithm, the mechanics completely alter the outcome. The 60% who find the candidate unacceptable are empowered to actively cast an against vote. The candidate receives a massive influx of negative data points.
So when you subtract the against votes from the F4 votes, the polarizing candidate's net score is dragged down significantly, very likely plunging into negative numbers.
Now, let's contrast that polarizing figure with a different archetype. The professor's lecture uses a hypothetical candidate labeled A. Candidate A is not particularly charismatic. They don't have a passionate base. In fact, they only secure about 5% core enthusiastic support.
But crucially, almost no one in the electorate actively dislikes them. Their policy signal is inoffensive across all dimensions.
Because candidate A triggers no deep dissatisfaction, no one bothers to cast an against vote on their behalf. Their net score remains a positive 5%. While the polarizing candidates are mathematically destroying each other with negative votes, the candidate who has, as the professor eloquently phrases it, said good morning to all 4 sides of the town, emerges victorious.
They win precisely because they are acceptable to everyone, thereby fulfilling our redefined goal, finding the least unacceptable candidate.
To demonstrate that this isn't merely an abstract mathematical theory, the lecture details the results of a real-world simulation the professor ran during a workshop, and we are reporting the empirical results of this simulation to illustrate the algorithm's mechanics.
Right. In this workshop, 40 participants were tasked with voting for the greatest Serbian statesman from a curated list of both historical and contemporary figures. They ran the election multiple times using different voting algorithms.
When the participants utilized the balanced approval method, the data revealed a fascinating behavioral split. Highly polarizing contemporary figures, the data cites Zoran Dinanic and Aleksandar Vučić, naturally drew a high volume of positive votes from their respective supporters.
But the math immediately self-corrected for their polarization.
Precisely. Because they were contemporary, highly visible figures with defined opposition, they also received a massive proportional volume of negative votes. The subtraction mechanism decimated their final net scores.
But the simulation was ultimately won by a figure who most participants likely hadn't thought about in years, Jovan Ristic. And examining why Ristic won is the perfect crystallization of the professor's theory.
Ristic was a 19th century statesman and diplomat.
For context, he represented Serbia at the Congress of Berlin in 1878. Serbia was in a precarious position after the Treaty of San Stefano had largely ignored Serbian interests in favor of a larger Bulgaria. Ristic navigated the great power politics at the Congress of Berlin to secure international recognition of Serbian independence and territorial expansion.
He was a highly competent pragmatist. As the professor notes, Ristich was not a populist firebrand. He was the technocrat the monarchy called upon when the nation was in existential crisis, and he was often quietly dismissed as soon as the crisis was averted. He did not inspire fanaticism.
Looking at the math of his victory in the simulation, Ristich received positive votes from the participants who possessed a deep understanding of diplomatic history and recognized his objective competence. But the defining metric was that he received absolutely zero negative votes.
He was a pure manifestation of the compromise candidate. His net score remained high because he did not trigger the persistent misery or active ideological opposition of a single voter in the room.
It's a flawless execution of the algorithm's intent. And beyond the elegance of the math, the professor highlights a highly practical benefit regarding the actual implementation of this system. Despite being a novel algorithmic approach to voting, the physical counting process is remarkably analog.
The ballots can be tallied manually, by hand, without relying on complex digital infrastructure.
This addresses a significant contemporary issue regarding the integrity of the ballot box. There is growing systemic anxiety globally regarding the vulnerability of electronic voting machines and digital tabulation.
By designing an algorithm that relies on simple arithmetic addition and subtraction that can be verified with a paper tally, the system eliminates that specific vector of public distrust.
The lecture includes a practical test they conducted to verify the speed and accuracy of manual tabulation. They generated 1,000 test ballots. To keep the test neutral, the voters were asked to evaluate 15 fruits and 15 vegetables using the balanced approval rules.
The data revealed that bananas were universally beloved, while kohlrabi and cauliflower drew intense negative voting.
The agricultural preferences aside, the logistical point was proven. A small team sat in a room and manually tabulated the net positive and negative scores for 30 distinct items across 1,000 ballots in a matter of hours.
The math is sophisticated, but the execution is entirely transparent and accessible.
So the balanced approval algorithm solves the problem of the ballot. It successfully measures the telecommunication signal, filters the noise, and identifies the candidate who minimizes societal dissatisfaction. We've elected our compromise candidate. But the moment that candidate sets foot inside the parliament building, they hit a structural wall. How do we ensure their voice isn't immediately drowned out by the geographic loopholes and gerrymandering we discussed earlier?
This requires us to examine the professor's solution for the legislative body itself. It's an algorithm for voting with voter weight. To grasp this, we have to completely abandon the foundational physical architecture of the legislature, the concept of one representative, one vote on the parliament floor.
This is perhaps the most difficult paradigm shift to internalize. We're accustomed to seeing a chamber of 500 politicians, and when a bill is proposed, 500 equal votes are cast. The professor argues that this physical equality in the chamber is the root cause of the mathematical inequality outside of it.
The algorithm the professor proposes is ruthlessly direct. A representative in parliament does not cast one abstracted equal vote. Instead, they cast a vote equal to the exact number of net balanced approval votes they secured in the general election.
The voting power of the politician is directly numerically tethered to the volume of citizens who endorse them.
Let's run the math on a hypothetical legislative session. A new infrastructure bill is on the floor. Member of Parliament has secured a net total of 100,000 balanced approval votes from a dense urban district.
When MPA registers their vote on the bill, the Parliament's tally registers 100,000 points.
Now consider Member of Parliament B, who barely survived a highly contested election in a sparsely populated rural district, securing only 300 net votes. When MPB registers their vote, the tally registers exactly 300 points.
The systemic implications of this adjustment are absolute. By assigning the voting power in the legislature to perfectly mirror the exact number of individual citizens, you instantly eradicate gerrymandering.
The practice becomes mathematically irrelevant.
Because it no longer matters how the lines on the map are drawn. A political party can draw a district that looks like a salamander, or they can aggressively pack 200,000 opposition voters into one district and spread 500 of their own voters into another.
The power dynamic in the capital remains entirely unaffected. The MP representing the 200,000 people will carry 200,000 times the voting weight of the MP representing the 500 people. You simply cannot steal legislative power by shifting territorial boundaries.
It connects the legislative action directly and proportionally back to the consent of the governed. It bypasses the artificial geographic constructs that political parties have manipulated for over 2 centuries. The physical representative is merely a conduit for the exact numerical weight of their constituency.
So, we've recalibrated the ballot to find the least unacceptable candidate, and we've neutralized geographic manipulation by weighting the parliamentary votes. We have built a mathematically sound representative body.
But there remains one major systemic flaw to address regarding how that body actually governs: the problem of the tyranny of the majority.
This is a critical vulnerability in almost all modern democracies. Currently, if a political party or a coalition secures just 51% of the voting power in a parliament, they control the entire legislative agenda.
Because every vote is a binary contest, that 51% majority can pass 100% of the laws they desire. They can completely shut out the 49% minority from achieving any legislative victories whatsoever.
And if we return to the professor's foundational psychological premise that misery is persistent, this outcome is disastrous. The minority is rendered effectively powerless, ensuring that 49% of the population remains in a persistent state of structural misery and dissatisfaction.
The mathematical system has failed to maintain societal stability.
To resolve this, the professor introduces the second major algorithm: block voting. This is a mechanism designed specifically to protect the minority and enforce proportional influence over the legislative output.
It's applied to situations where Parliament is required to process multiple items, passing a slate of laws, approving a package of investment programs, or electing multiple individuals to a panel of judges.
The algorithm works by altering the sequential nature of Parliament. Instead of voting on one law, passing it, and moving to the next, the Parliament evaluates a large block of items simultaneously. They utilize the balanced approval method we discussed earlier.
The MPs, utilizing their heavily weighted votes, cast FOR and against votes across the different laws within the block.
But the algorithm introduces a crucial structural constraint, a rule that mechanically forces compromise by actively diluting the power of the majority. The rule states, once an option or a candidate wins in a round of voting, every MP who voted FOR that winning option temporarily loses their right to vote for the remaining options in that specific cycle.
They are mathematically sidelined. Let's walk through a detailed hypothetical to see how this strategically alters behavior on the floor of Parliament. Imagine a scenario where the majority party holds 60% of the total weighted voting power. The minority party holds 40%. There's a block of 10 distinct laws on the docket.
Under the traditional binary system, the majority party would vote as a unified block 10 separate times, passing all 10 of their preferred laws, leaving the minority with nothing.
But under the block voting algorithm, the strategy must change entirely. If the majority party directs all of their 60% voting weight toward their absolute highest priority law, that law will easily pass in the first round. However, the rule is triggered. Every MP who voted for that winning law is now sidelined for the remainder of the block.
Which means the 40% minority is suddenly the only voting bloc left on the floor. The minority is now in complete, unchecked control to pass the next several laws in the bloc according to their own preferences.
Precisely. The algorithm punishes concentration of power. Therefore, to prevent the minority from taking total control of the subsequent rounds, the majority is mathematically forced to dilute its power from the very beginning.
The majority cannot put all 60% of its weight behind one law. They must spread their votes thinly across multiple options, calculating the precise ratios needed to edge out the minority on a few key laws, while implicitly conceding that they do not possess the math to win everything.
This mechanism mathematically enforces what the professor designates as the fourth axiom of democracy. The axiom asserts that a functional democracy should not be defined as the absolute rule of the majority, but rather the rule of all voters in exact proportion to their presence in the society.
With the block voting algorithm functioning correctly, if a minority faction holds exactly 3% of the weighted voting power, they will successfully navigate the diluted rounds to pass exactly 3% of the laws or fill 3% of the available seats.
The lecture also points out that this structure formally encourages the practice of log rolling. Log rolling is the coordination of votes among smaller, disparate factions. If no single group has the power to dominate the bloc, smaller groups are incentivized to form temporary, pragmatic alliances.
They might pool their limited percentages to collectively vote against a massive infrastructure project they all find unacceptable, or coordinate their votes to ensure a shared priority passes in a later round. It guarantees that the minority extracts a proportional slice of the legislative output.
It's a profound re-engineering of legislative behavior. By making it mathematically impossible for a slight majority to dominate every single outcome, the algorithm forces collaboration, strategic dilution of power, and strict proportionality. The 51% majority gets exactly 51% of the outcomes, and not a fraction more.
As we conclude this deep dive into Professor Inck's algorithms, it's worth synthesizing the progression of these ideas. We began by discarding the subjective, impossible quest for the best leader. We replaced it with a rigorous mathematical optimization for the least unacceptable candidate, explicitly designed to minimize persistent societal misery and prevent instability.
We examined the balanced approval voting algorithm, using for and against ratios, to identify that compromise candidate by allowing negative data to filter out polarizing extremists. We then applied the exact numerical weight of those voters directly to the parliamentary floor, instantly rendering the geographic manipulation of gerrymandering obsolete.
And finally, we explored the block voting mechanism, forcing the dilution of majority power to guarantee that every minority receives exact, proportional legislative representation.
It invites a serious thought experiment. Imagine how the mechanics of your own local elections or the behavior of your national legislature might fundamentally shift if these mathematical constraints were applied. The overarching tone of political campaigning would have to transform from maximizing polarization to actively seeking broad tolerability.
It is a compelling vision of structural reform, and there is one final, unexplored mechanism from the lecture that we should leave you to consider. The professor designed a specific mathematical failsafe regarding the concept of a system of quotients. This addresses representation quotas, such as gender or national minority representation.
The algorithm functions automatically. For example, if a parliament is legally required to maintain a 40% gender representation threshold and the election results fall below that mark, the system intervenes. It calculates a performance quotient for every elected official.
It then systematically identifies and removes the lowest performing male candidates from the winning party, replacing them with the highest performing female candidates from that exact same district, iterating the process until the 40% balance is mathematically achieved.
It's a rigid, entirely cold mathematical solution to a deeply complex, historically fraught social issue. It applies absolute ratios to enforce diversity. If a political party apparatus knows, without a doubt, that the underlying math will automatically override their selected roster to enforce a demographic balance, how might that algorithmic certainty change the very nature of how they recruit, fund, and campaign for candidates in the first place? It's a fascinating structural question to explore on your own. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today.